go back in antiquity. Bread actually wasn't bread as we know it today. It's actually morsels of food that we could consume. And if you wanted to consume morsels of food, you have to do a ton of work. You have to take that food, plant it, grow it, pick the produce, create a dish, eat the produce. That's a lot of work. But I'm assuming that everybody in this room will probably have to go to work, make some money, and then spend that money on some food. Ideally something that, isn't Maggie or something. But we have a problem. And there is a real problem. This survey happens every year. The number doesn't shift. 80% of us hate our jobs. And I was really aware of this over the Olympics and the work in the down. I worked for a global advertising agency at that point. We had teams in about 5 or 6 different countries. And we would do a global happiness survey. And consistently, my go down team would be like, "We are so happy!" And actually, I'm sitting there going, "You're miserable. You are absolutely miserable. You come into work at about 12 o'clock. I expect you at 9. You kind of leave at 7 o'clock, and if I give you some work, you look really miserable. So what's going on?" So I started thinking about what's the differences about work here and in the West. I started thinking about how do I make a change, and I started interviewing people up and down the country. And so this talk is entitled Work and Happiness. I think that, unlike bread and butter, it probably sounds like it shouldn't go together, but I really think it should. So the first thing I learned was about work and the history of work in this part of the world that we call India. And it's actually quite different to the history of work in different other places. At least that's what I get the impression. We started with hunter-gatherer mentalities. We had nomadic tribes. We still have nomadic tribes in India who move around bartering for their produce. Obviously, we discovered how to grow wheat, and we settled somewhere. As the production of farming came through, we started creating our own food, and we started just bartering the surplus of that food. And we see that in India today. 70% of this country remains an agricultural country, as we saw in the earlier talk. So then we started creating, we traded down meal and spice route. By the time the Roman Empire came through, we were known, this part of the world was known for the most amazing exotic spices that were traded down that route. So what would we do? We had a farm behind us. We'd create a retail store. It was one of the first retail stores. We'd start selling produce at that point. And then what we would do is we'd say, "Hey, my son, Vita, go down 10 miles down the road and create another store, because we've got so much surplus, we'll take that down that route." And the Silk Road opened up with us, our family members, periodically creating what we now know as retail stores. Back then, they were just little stores with a lot of food on it. Right down so that we traded along this massive route into the European Empire. And that was your horizontal organizational structure. There wasn't this hierarchy that we see today, right? The next thing that we did was we became rich as a sort of region. We started attracting our foreign friends, right? We had the Mughal Empire, we then had our European empires, and we had the East Indian Company come through. And we know from that period that they actually had a standing army. If you imagine a corporate structure today, it's very much like a standing army, right? You have your senior boss, you have your super boss, you have your middle people, you have your juniors who have to get stuff done. We all know this, you all call each other ma'am and sir, and you have your hierarchies that go through that. So we've gone from this very linear structure down the Silk Road to this incredibly horizontal structure that actually doesn't kind of equate. But we live in a land, so then fast forward again, we live in a land that then became independent from all of that and started looking at socialism. And we started looking at socialism and thinking, actually what we need is more work for people. So if you go to an airport, well, you see this in all sorts of works of life, but the most striking for me is if you go to an airport, someone checks your ticket and lets you into the building. Someone checks your passport, says, yep, you're allowed to go wherever you're going. Someone else then tears the ticket up and says, right, you can get on this plane and stamp to get in. Any other country, that's kind of one person, right? But for a whole variety of reasons, that's 4 people here. And in any other walk of life that I work in, that's going to be a robot. Because we just don't have that kind of resources in any other part of the world as we do here. So we live in this world where we've got bloated, hierarchical structures with horizontal structures that want to go through, and yet we're seen as the tiger economy. We are the future, and here we are wondering whether we're going to be happy at work. So I had a little bit of a think. We looked at this earlier with one of the talks about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you are going to work, as we discussed earlier, just for safety and physiology, that's one thing. But if you're going to work for happiness, we're right there at self-actualization, which I can't almost say, so I'm just going to call it happiness. So then I started thinking about talking to you guys, right? You aren't in the world of work yet. So what is it that you will face? Why is it that in about 7 years' time, you, like everyone in my team, will be miserable at work? And there's some real reasons that start right here while you're at college. The first one is you probably have no idea what you want to do when you get out there. I mean, you may do. You may be here studying engineering and you want to be a photographer or a Bollywood star or a, I don't know, race driver or something. But very few people who come into an engineering college may know that, right? You may still not know that. You may be in your 3rd year and still not know. You may not have any idea what careers really mean to you. In a country where 70% of us is in agriculture, but only about 3 or 4% of us are in MNCs, you may not have role models in your family or in your friends group to actually say, what's it like to go into an MNC, right? So where do you start looking for that? This is a little bit more like me. If you're like me and you probably just like to party and hang out and you want to be independent from your family, you want that bottle of, I don't know, old monk at the end of the day, you probably just get the job that's going to pay you the most amount of cash, right? And that's probably, you're going to be really glad if someone gives you a few bucks to do that. You may be a little bit more grown up about it than I am, and you might want just security. I'm talk to a lot of young people in this country who just want security, so they rush for cash. But they don't really think about whether they're going to be happy in that job. The last one I thought was really interesting. If you're completely unlike me and quite academic and really motivated, you might see the big wide world of getting your workplace as an extension of what you're doing here. If every year you want to get a grade, then you might go to a company like Accenture that will assess you every year and give you a grade and say, yes, you can have the next promotion. This structure might not suit you in a few years' time. So my thought is this. I want you to forget capitalism and the drive for money. We've seen from the 2008 crisis that it's actually not working in our favour, and I could do many other talks about how it doesn't work in our favour. Socialism. Everything you know about socialism, good or bad, needs to be reassessed as well. We flirted with it, it has worked, it hasn't worked, I don't know. But socialism is currently the most searched term on the Webster Dictionary, as people like ourselves are trying to figure out what the alternative to capitalism is. But most importantly for me is to get the yarn. Every time I talk to people, continually, what I really get is that there are all these stories. Isna ye kara, that happened, this story, you can't do this. You want to take all of that and start with a blank piece of paper and start again. And there's a few principles while you start with a blank piece of paper I want you to think about. First of all, your career from now till the end is incredibly long. I've done about 20 years of mine. I reckon I'll do another 30 years, right? I know the retirement age of getting my PF is about 57, 58. I know that in the UK it's about 65, but actually by the time I get to 65, I'm going to have to work another 10, 15 years, because that's just the way our economies are going. So if you're sitting here looking at the milk round and going, I need to get that job, that's the most important thing for me, and you don't get it, then don't stress out. You actually have all of these points to go in your career over the next 40 years. There will be loads more milk routes, loads more internships that you have to think about. If you have your highs now, great. If you have your lows now, ride them. But it's a very long ride to the end of that journey. The other thing I want you to think about is the value of the professional. The person who washes the floor in this country, the person who washes the floor, who washes your crockery, and the person who washes your car seems to have 3 different statuses. And that isn't a world that we should be living in. If the person who washes your floor gets to work every day, does an amazing job of it, they are a professional. In the same way, if you come into work and you do an amazing job, you get there on time, you get your job delivered in a meaningful way, you're still a professional. You want to look at everybody and every task that's being operated as a professional value. The next thing to think about is compassion, right? You're in an environment where you are competing against each other all the time. There are people who work hard and that's all they do, they study. There are people who do loads of events, there are loads of people who just study the day before, right? They may get the reward for that when it happens. They may not. They may get the internship that you are wanting, right? They may not. But these people will go through their ebbs and flows at different rates from you, right? They will go through different points. If you can help somebody, or if you can feel compassionate for them, that's really important, right? The other thing that I think is interesting is about privilege. When I talk to a lot of people, they talk about, I don't want to ask Daddy for that job, right? I don't want to just ride off those credentials. I know I could, right? And yet there's a whole other group of people that actually want those contacts. They're like, oh, if only I was like so-and-so, because he's got, Daddy's going to give him a job. This is actually understanding your privileges. If you're the person who has the privilege of having a father or a parent or an uncle who's going to be able to give you a network of opportunities, and you don't want to use them, then why don't you help the next person you can? Why don't you actually look at somebody and say, right, I don't want to use that opportunity, but my mate here really wants to. So help them out. Understand the privileges you have, and then capitalize them if you need them. Don't leave them on the shelf and say, oh, I wish I'd done that in 5 years' time. And if you don't want them, then help someone else use it. The other thing to think about is happiness is a range, right? There's the euphoric happiness that you get from like partying hard all night and being with your mates and out there. There's the other extreme of like, I didn't get that internship, I didn't get that job, it was really miserable. There's definitely that range. There's obviously depression range and a higher euphoric madness range. But you need to understand what range you want to be in actual workplace, right? At my workplace, I come in every day, I get my job done, and then I get an email saying, come to BITS, and I'm like, yes, this sounds fantastic, and I'm really happy for a while. And then I realize I have to do the actual presentation, and I go back to my status quo. So you actually have to know what that range is, and feel comfortable in the range that you want to be at work. When I was at the Olympics, I can tell you that the range was up here. It was amazing. It was a constant adrenaline rush. We have that job. It's the biggest thing in the world for that one moment. You know, it's a euphoric rush, but I can tell you I can't do that across a marathon sprint that is my career. And lastly, I want you to think about fun. A lot of us go like, it's work. It's really, really hard, because that's what we've been told it is, and we've been academic for so long. But I think one thing that as Indians I've seen is that we're really good at doing masti, right? We're really good at really enjoying the things that we do. And so on my last point, I want you to think about having as much fun as possible. Thank you very much.